descendants of the old gods. That's the best way to say it. That they believe that they are carriers of a seed line that gives them the divine right to rule. And that is what gives them justification spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, scientifically to dominate the lesser species known as humans. Humans literally means a lesser species of man, and they do not believe they are a human.
A single sentence, 4 words buried inside it. And for thousands of years, almost no one stopped long enough to ask what those 4 words actually mean. Genesis 6-4, most people read right past it. They see the word giants, they assume it is myth, they turn the page, but there is a phrase sitting inside that verse that does not belong in a story that is supposed to be over. The text reads, "There were giants on the earth in those days and also afterward." And also afterward. After what? After the judgment? After the flood that was supposed to wash the earth clean? The Bible itself is saying that whatever happened in Genesis 6 did not end. It continued. It bled forward into time. And the people who copied that text, who memorized it, who built entire theologies around it, most of them never asked why. The ancient scribes knew. The communities that lived near the Dead Sea knew. The writers of the Book of Enoch, one of the oldest surviving Jewish texts outside the Bible, knew exactly what that phrase meant. They wrote volumes about it. They named names. They described what came down, what was born, what was destroyed, and what was not. And then those volumes were removed. Not lost, not forgotten by accident, removed. Hi viewers, before we go any deeper into this, here is a question only you can answer. When you read the Bible, is there a verse or a story that always felt incomplete to you, like something important was left out? Drop it in the comments right now, because what you are about to hear may be exactly why that feeling never went away. The question that pulls everything open is not whether the Nephilim existed. The question is, why the people closest to this story, the scribes, the priests, the councils that shape the Bible as it is read today, chose to leave only a fragment, 1 verse, 4 haunting words, and centuries of silence after it. What were they protecting people from knowing? What was so dangerous about the full story that it had to be buried inside the oldest book in the world? The answer does not start in a library. It does not start with a theologian's footnote or a museum exhibit. It starts in the text itself, in the verses that most people read every year without realizing they are looking directly at a wound that was never allowed to heal. The scroll is fragile. The ink is brown. The Hebrew letters are pressed so close together that a modern reader would miss entire words without training. And the man copying it is not a king, not a prophet. He is a scribe, anonymous. Working by lamplight, somewhere in Judea, most likely in the 2nd or 3rd century before the Common Era. He is not writing something new. He is copying something old. What he is transcribing is a text that the religious establishment of his day considers sacred but dangerous. The Book of Enoch, a work attributed to Enoch, the 7th patriarch from Adam, described in Genesis 5:24 as a man who walked with God and was not, for God took him. The scribe does not question the source. He copies, and the story he copies describes something that the book of Genesis only whispers about. It describes 200 divine beings called the Watchers, who looked at human women and made a decision they were never authorized to make. They descended, they took wives, and from those unions came children who were not fully human. The text calls them the Nephilim, the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall, depending on the translation. And those children, according to the Book of Enoch, did not just exist. They consumed, they destroyed, they taught humanity knowledge that was never meant to be unlocked. The scribe keeps writing. He is not writing fiction. He believes every word. The community he belongs to, likely connected to the same circles that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, treats the Book of Enoch not as mythology, but as history, as warning, as a record of something that actually happened. Dead Sea Scroll fragments, discovered in Cave 4 at Qumran beginning in 1947, confirmed that multiple copies of the Book of Enoch existed in the ancient Jewish world. These were not fringe documents. They were preserved alongside Isaiah, alongside Psalms, alongside the text that became the Bible. Someone kept them on purpose, which means someone else later made a decision to set them aside, to let the full story fade while 4 words in Genesis 6-4 remain just enough to confirm something happened, not enough to explain what. The scribe finishes his work. He rolls the scroll carefully. He has no idea that 2,000 years later, fragments of what he copied will be pulled from a desert cave and force scholars to ask questions that organized religion had spent centuries trying to close. Numbers 13. The 12 spies returned from Canaan. They have been sent to scout the land God promised.
Program, a super soldier program, where they're actively looking for these remains of the giants or the living giants, and they're using their DNA in some kind of black budget project.
Would we be surprised, though?
They come back with their report, and the first thing out of their mouths is not about the crops, not about the rivers, not about the walls of the cities. It is about the people. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Numbers 13:33. And the flood has already happened. The flood that was supposed to end everything. If the Nephilim were wiped out in Genesis 6, what are trained military scouts reporting centuries later inside the borders of the Promised Land? This is not a poetic metaphor. These are men assigned to gather intelligence for a military campaign. They are describing what they saw, and what they saw stopped them cold. The phrase descendants of Anak connects to a people called the Anakim, a group that appears repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible and is associated with extraordinary size and physical power. Joshua 11:21 records Joshua cutting them off from Hebron, Debir, and Anab. Joshua 11:22 states plainly that none of the Anakim remained in the land of the Israelites, but that some remained in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. Gath, the same city that later produces a warrior named Goliath of Gath, described in 1 Samuel 17 as standing over 9 feet tall. The biblical text is not telling one story. It is telling a connected story across books, across centuries, across generations. Go back further. Genesis 6:1 through 6-4 is 4 verses. 4 verses that set the entire theological crisis of the pre-flood world in motion. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Hebrew phrase translated as sons of God is Bnei Ha-Elohim. In every other place, this exact phrase appears in the Hebrew Bible. Job 1-6, Job 2-1, Job 38-7. It refers to divine beings, not human beings, not kings, not the righteous line of Seth. Divine beings who operate in the heavenly council described throughout the Old Testament. Early Jewish interpreters did not debate this. The earliest readings of Genesis 6, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Book of Enoch, in the Book of Jubilees, are unanimous. The sons of God are divine beings who crossed a boundary they were forbidden to cross. Second Temple Judaism, the era that shaped how the Hebrew Bible was understood before the time of Jesus, treated the Watcher story as foundational. It explained evil. It explained why the flood came. It explained why something was still wrong with the world even after the flood. And it explained why the land of Canaan, the land God told Israel to take, was occupied by descendants of those events. One crossing of a divine boundary, generations of consequences, and a question the text never fully closes. If judgment came once and the line continued, what exactly was the point of the flood? Cave 4.
Distinguished as the daughters of Cain. You don't find that, right?
Okay.
And then you have another issue. How does it make any coherent sense that you have human-to-human relationship, and it's the human-to-human relationship that produces the Nephilim, the giants?
Right.
It's like, wait, what? Like, how does that?
the Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, the Damascus document, text describing the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the consequences of forbidden knowledge in detail that Genesis 6 never provides. The Book of Giants, partially reconstructed from fragments found at Qumran, describes the Nephilim themselves experiencing prophetic dreams, visions of their own destruction. The giants, born from Watcher unions, dream of a flood, of a great garden being uprooted, of fire coming from above. They are terrified. They send messengers to Enoch, who is already walking with God, asking him to intercede, to explain, to appeal on their behalf. Enoch brings back no comfort. The message is judgment. Dr. Loren Stuckenbrook, professor of New Testament at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich and one of the world's leading scholars on Enochic literature, has written extensively on how the Book of Giants frames the Nephilim not simply as physical threats, but as moral failures, beings who represent the catastrophic outcome of power exercised without divine restraint. His work on the Qumran fragments establishes that these were not ghost stories. They were theological instruction. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar in Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages who held a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, argued in his research that the Watcher narrative in Genesis 6 must be read through the lens of Second Temple Judaism to be properly understood. The early Jewish world did not read this as allegory. They read it as historical record, a cosmic crime with earthly consequences. The Dead Sea Scrolls community preserved these texts because they believed the pattern was real. They believed the boundary between the divine realm and the human realm had been violated once and could be violated again. Their entire theology of spiritual warfare, of hidden evil forces operating behind human events, traced directly back to Genesis 6 and the Watcher story. The Book of Jubilees, another ancient Jewish text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, goes further. It states that after the flood, 1/10 of the spirits of the Nephilim, the disembodied spirits of the giants who died, were permitted to remain on earth, not to rebuild, not to restore, to lead astray. That is the world these ancient communities believed they were living inside. A world where the consequences of Genesis 6 were still active, still walking, still working. And the text they used to prove it was not speculation. It was the same Hebrew Bible that sits on shelves in millions of homes today, read every year by people who have no idea what the communities closest to it actually believed, it said. Mesopotamia. 3,000 years before the Common Era, scribes press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets and record a list. Not a law code, not a prayer, a king list. The Sumerian king list, discovered in the early 20th century and now housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, records the rulers of ancient Sumer going back to what the text calls before the flood. The reigns listed for pre-flood kings are not measured in years. They are measured in thousands of years. One king rules for 28,800 years, another for 36,000. The list records 8 kings across 5 cities who ruled before a great flood swept over the land. After the flood, the list states, kingship descended from heaven again, and the reigns dropped to human scale. Before the flood, something different was on the earth. The Sumerian scribes are saying the same thing Genesis says. The scales are different. The language is different. The culture is completely different. But the structure is
So they go
identical.
down there and they destroy
A
the
pre-flood
Nephilim
world
and
where
they
beings of
arrest,
extraordinary
they
power and
imprison
longevity
the
existed.
Watchers.
A flood that ended that world.
And they get
and
assigned
a
to the
post-flood
abyss,
era where
to the
ordinary
pit.
human rule
Okay,
resumed.
that's the punishment.
The Epic of
But
Gilgamesh,
while they're in the punishment,
one of the
in the
oldest
pit,
written
they're like,
stories in human
well, this
history,
sucks, you know,
opens by describing its
maybe we
hero
should
as
repent and tell God
2/3
we're
divine
sorry
and
and
1/3 human,
you know,
born of a union between worlds. Gilgamesh is not framed as a monster. He is framed as the greatest of men, a king who built the walls of Uruk and reached for immortality. But the text is clear about what his mixed nature produces: unchecked power. A king who takes what he wants, who exhausts his people, who crosses every boundary until the gods themselves intervene. The parallel to the Nephilim narrative is not accidental. Both traditions are drawing on a shared ancient memory, a time when the boundary between the divine and the human broke down, and the result was not paradise. It was catastrophe. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the Ogdoad of Hermopolis, primordial beings of extraordinary nature who existed before creation was ordered. Canaanite mythology describes the Rephaim shades of ancient warrior kings of enormous stature, who haunt the underworld and are connected to the living world of giants like the Anakim mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. These are not parallel mythologies that happen to rhyme. Scholars of ancient Near Eastern literature, including John Walton of Wheaton College, have demonstrated that the Hebrew Bible was written by people who knew these traditions, who lived in a world saturated with these stories, and who were making specific theological claims in response to them. The Nephilim story is not a Jewish invention dropped into a vacuum. It is Israel's answer to a question every ancient civilization was asking. What was in the world before us? Why was it destroyed? And why does the world still feel broken? No civilization had a clean answer. Every one of them remembered the question, and every one of them remembered that something was left behind. It was not the size that broke the world. That is the part that gets missed every single time. People hear the word Nephilim and they picture enormous bodies, physical force, brute destruction. And yes, the ancient texts describe beings of extraordinary stature. But the biblical record and the Enochic literature are both pointing at something far more precise than size. They are pointing at what the Nephilim represented, what they unlocked, what they made possible simply by existing. The book of Enoch, chapters 7 and 8, lay it out without softening a single word. The Watchers did not just produce giant offspring. They transferred knowledge. Azazel, one of the lead Watchers named in the text, taught men how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught women the art of beautification and seduction. Other Watchers taught enchantments, the cutting of roots, astrology, the movement of celestial bodies, knowledge that human civilization, in the view of these ancient writers, was never supposed to have at that stage of its development. This is the detail that changes everything. The danger of the Nephilim was not just physical, it was civilizational, it was moral. A threshold was crossed, not just between divine and human bodies, but between what humanity was ready to carry and what it was handed before it had the wisdom to use it responsibly. The result, according to Genesis 6-5, was that every inclination of human thought was toward destruction, continuously, without pause. The earth, the text says, was filled with violence, not conflict, not war in the ordinary sense. The Hebrew word used is Hamas, a word that carries the weight of systemic, pervasive wrongdoing that corrupts the social and moral fabric completely. The world did not have a problem. The world had become the problem. And the flood was not punishment in the way most people imagine it. Scholars like John H. Walton have pointed out that the ancient Near Eastern understanding of a divine flood was not simple revenge. It was an act of cosmic reset, an uncreation of a world that had corrupted itself beyond recovery. God was not angry. God was grieved. Genesis 6-6 uses the Hebrew word Nachem, a word that means
the Watchers, that's Enoch's term for the sons of God of Genesis 6, descend earth. They make a pact among themselves to, have children and corrupt humanity and the whole thing again. So they descend to Mount Hermon and they hatch their plot. So
That moment did not stay in the past. The vote happens in 364 CE. Bishops gather at the Council of Laodicea. Among the decisions made a list of books considered acceptable for public reading in Christian churches. The Book of Enoch is not on it. That is not an accident. That is a choice. By the time of the Council of Laodicea, the Book of Enoch had already been circulating for centuries. The New Testament writers knew it. Jude 14 through 15 quotes it directly, not as a vague reference, not as a metaphor, but as a citation. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone. The author of Jude is pulling a specific passage from 1 Enoch, 1 to 9, and placing it inside the New Testament as prophetic. Authority. The early church knew the Book of Enoch existed. They read it. Some of them treated it as scripture. And then, across a period of several centuries, that changed. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never accepted that change. To this day, the Ethiopian Bible includes 1 Enoch as canonical part of the accepted body of sacred scripture. The Ethiopian Church traces its Christianity to the 4th century, to the conversion of King Azana, and it preserved the Enochic tradition without interruption. That means the Book of Enoch has been read as sacred text in continuous Christian practice for over 16 centuries, just not in the Western tradition that shaped most of modern Christianity. Why was it removed elsewhere? Scholars have offered several answers, and none of them are comfortable. One argument is theological. The Watcher story created problems for later Christian frameworks. If divine beings could sin, could fall, could produce physical offspring, it complicated developing doctrines about the nature of angels, about the structure of the spiritual world, about the boundary between heaven and earth. Another argument is institutional. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the church was centralizing authority. Texts that existed outside the core canon gave communities too much access to alternative frameworks, alternative explanations for evil, for suffering, for the nature of cosmic conflict. Controlling the canon meant controlling the theology. Biblical scholar Philip Esler, in his work on early Jewish and Christian texts, has noted that the Enochic tradition represented a complete cosmological system, one that could stand independently of the emerging rabbinic Judaism and developing Christian orthodoxy. It did not need to be attacked. It simply needed to be sidelined. And it was. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed that calculation permanently. When the fragments came out of the Qumran caves, scholars could no longer treat the Book of Enoch as a peripheral curiosity. It was a central text of the community closest in time and geography to the world the New Testament was born from. Something was set aside on purpose. The question no institution has fully answered is this: what were they afraid the full story would make ordinary people believe? Jude already said it. 2 Peter already confirmed it. The New Testament did not bury the Watcher story. It carried it forward. Jude, verse 6. And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. 2 Peter 2, 4. For if God did not spare angels
the
when they
authors
sinned,
of Scripture believed the
sent them
gods
to
of the
Tartarus,
nations were
putting
real.
them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. But these are not vague spiritual references. These are two separate New Testament authors pointing at the same event, the sin of the Watchers described in 1 Enoch and Genesis 6, and using it as the anchor example of divine judgment. The logic in both passages is this: if God judged beings that powerful, God will judge these too. The Watcher story is not mythology being borrowed for color. It is the foundation of the argument, which means the New Testament writers believed it happened. And here is where the reframe lands with full force. The Nephilim were The Nephilim were never just a race of large people. They were the embodied consequence of a cosmic decision, the proof that power exercised outside of divine order does not produce greatness. It produces destruction. Every ancient community that preserved any version of this story understood it the same way. The Nephilim were a warning written in flesh. The warning was not just for the people living before the flood. Jude 14 through 15 is addressed forward to people who will face judgment. 2 Peter 2 is a letter written to living communities being warned about teachers and leaders who operate outside of righteous boundaries. The ancient example is used to illuminate a present danger. The Nephilim were never the point. The pattern they represent is the point. Unchecked power, forbidden knowledge, the collapse of boundaries that exist for human protection, and the certainty stated plainly in 2 New Testament books that judgment follows. The warning did not expire with the flood. It was preserved in the text, specifically, deliberately, and aimed at the world that was coming next. That world is the one being lived in right now. The names change. The pattern does not. Genesis 6 describes a world where beings with access to extraordinary power used it to take what they wanted, teach what should not have been taught, and consume resources, human, material, and moral without limit or consequence. The ancient writers said the earth was filled with Hamas, pervasive, systemic wrongdoing that corrupted everything it touched. Look at the world today through that same lens and ask whether the pattern is gone. Concentrated power operating without transparency. Knowledge, genetic, technological, digital, advancing faster than the ethical frameworks that are supposed to govern it. Institutions with reach across entire populations making decisions that ordinary people never vote on, never see, and are rarely told about until the consequences are already embedded. The Book of Enoch warns specifically about the transfer of forbidden knowledge information given to humanity before it had the moral development to use it without destroying itself. That framework does not require a supernatural explanation to apply today. It requires honesty about what is being built, by whom, for what purpose, and who bears the cost when it fails. Dr. Michael Heiser, before his death in February 2023, spent years arguing publicly that the biblical cosmic conflict, the war between ordered divine rule and rebellious powers, was not a metaphor the ancient writers used to explain things they did not understand. It was a framework they used to describe something real about the structure of power and the nature of evil. His work, including The Unseen Realm, published by Lexham Press in 2015, brought this conversation into mainstream evangelical scholarship in a way that could not be easily dismissed. The Nephilim were dangerous because they were the product of a broken boundary. And broken boundaries do not heal themselves. They expand. They establish new normals. They make the next crossing easier. The ancient writers who preserved the Book of Enoch, who copied it by hand in desert caves, who refused to let it disappear, they were not preserving history as a museum piece. They were preserving a diagnostic, a way of seeing the world clearly enough to recognize the pattern before it completes. The question is whether the pattern is already completing now. The scroll, the anonymous Second Temple scribe copied by lamplight, is still being read, not by one community in one cave in the Judean desert, by scholars on every continent, by theologians inside traditions that spent centuries ignoring it, by ordinary people who felt that Genesis 6-4 was only showing them the edge of something that went much deeper. They were right. The Book of Enoch survived. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived. The fragments of the Book of Giants survived. The citations in Jude and 2 Peter survived. The Anakim references in Joshua survived. Goliath of Gath survived in the text. The Sumerian king list survived. The Epic of Gilgamesh survived. Every culture, every civilization, every ancient writing tradition that touched this question preserved something, not because the preservation was coordinated, because the memory was too important to lose. There is a thread that runs from Genesis 6 through the Dead Sea Scrolls, through the New Testament, through the Ethiopian Bible, through Qumran Cave, 4 through the scholarship of Stuckenbrook and Heiser, and it does not terminate in the ancient world. It surfaces in the present. In the questions people carry about why the world is broken and the specific ways it is broken, in the sense that what is called progress keeps producing consequences that look remarkably like what the oldest texts warned about, The Nephilim story is not a curiosity. It is not a footnote. It is one of the most carefully preserved warnings in the entire history of human writing, preserved across languages, cultures, centuries, and theological systems by people who believed, with complete seriousness, that the pattern it described would not stay buried. They were not wrong. This story is not finished. The questions it opens about the Book of Enoch, about the Watchers, about what the Dead Sea Scrolls community believed about the world they were living in, about the giants still recorded in Joshua and Samuel, about the cosmic framework the New Testament writers took for granted, those questions have full answers, and this channel is going to pursue every one of them. If this documentary opens something in the way this ancient text is read and understood, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. Every new documentary on this channel goes deeper into the hidden roots of sacred history, ancient texts, and the questions that organized religion has not always been willing to ask out loud. Leave a comment below. Share what this raised for you. The people watching alongside you right now are asking the same questions, and the conversation that starts in those comments matters. The next documentary is already coming, and what it uncovers about what was deliberately left out of the story most people were handed, that is not a discussion that can wait.